Hello and welcome to the free will debate with challenger Zachary Miller, who will be taking the positive, and defender Will to Power, who will be taking the negative. Good evening, gentlemen. Hope you are well. We will be going immediately into the debate proceedings. We'll ask the audience as they start to come in to please vote. 1 for free will, 2 for no free will, and we will compare those tallies with what we get at the end, as well as with our pre-debate Twitter poll. I'll ask the audience to hold their questions to the end, and once the formal debate has finished, we can go to the audience questions and have a bit of a back and forth there. So we have decided that the challenger will be going first. We'll start with a 3-minute opening to defend your basic thesis in favor of free will. Over to you, Zach.
Okay, so the doctrine of free will has never been falsified, and it makes really good predictions. One of the predictions it makes is that before a person acts, a person will perceive multiple actions that he or she can take, and this prediction plays out in our experience. Another prediction made by free will is that there will be times when, after a person acts, they will perceive that the choice that they made was actually on their own. If free will did not exist, this would predict that people could be absolutely controlled down to the minutest decision by mastering their causality functions. Now, this has certainly not been demonstrated to be true. People behave unpredictably. Because of this, it is more reasonable to assume that free will exists. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to defend the weakest possible version of free will. This is the doctrine that free will merely means the ability to choose from among alternative choices, and this is the position of most of the Greek and medieval philosophers. Stronger versions of free will would include the following. So I'm not going to attempt to argue that free will implies some break in the chain of causation whereby something else would have happened had free will not been exercised. Instead, I will argue that free will is a link in the chain of causation. And in fact, I will admit that everything that happened prior to making a choice led to that choice in a way that wasn't free. And everything that follows that choice is proximately caused by that choice. The choice is the only free part in the chain of causation. And I will also not attempt to argue that the strong position of free will, that free will is the ability to choose between a good action and a bad action, because I do not believe this to be the case. In classical thought, our bad actions are done because our passions overpower our will. When we act badly, it's because our will is being enslaved by our passions. So I will only argue that free will in the sense of a choice between alternative good actions. In very simple terms, I intend to show that when we mean to make a pizza, there are multiple ways to do this, and we can freely choose whether we use pepperoni, sausage, or mushrooms, or whether we use a thin crust for a thick crust, and that's all I intend to do. So the idea is that when I define my term and state my axioms, the existence of free will, or more accurately, free choice, will be more or less tautological. A tautology is self-proving, and this means that assuming the underlying premises I lay out are true, free will prove itself. Thank you.
Okay, we've still got 45 seconds on the clock. We ask the participants to please use up all the time in the allotted portions. We'll go over to you, Will to Power, for 3 minutes against free will.
My position against free will is definitional. I don't think that I do believe that human beings have a will, but these wills aren't free. They are influenced by minor desires. You have the ultimate desire, which is where the personality wants to go, and the options that are available for that personality differ from different circumstance to different circumstance. And so what we see when we see the options of choice, it is a internal reflection on where the personality wants to go with that choice. Why does the personality choose the salad over the steak, or going for a run to sitting on the couch and watching television? This is because the will is being synchronized with the personality. The personality recognizes that the ultimate will exists, the ultimate aesthetic exists, and one can either synchronize or desynchronize with that. Now, each of these have causes and reactions. So if one does not identify or synchronize with one's will, then one will be essentially punished by other internal reflections such as lack of fulfillment, depression, social ostracism, like continuing on and so on and so forth. This is the reason why people seem to turn to higher powers or greater what's the word I'm looking for? Why they go to look for greater meaning in life, and why other people don't do that is because they literally don't have that option to take. To say that one has freedom in their choice is to seem to assume that one always has the option to choose the right thing. I don't think human beings have that ability, and so I would say that the choices that we make are not free. And so defending the weakest position of non-free will, it is that our choices are never free. So how can we have free will?
Okay, is that the end?
I suppose so.
Okay, so we've you guys actually took the exact same amount of time there. All right, perfect. So we'll go to the first question, and that'll. Sorry, Zach, you're getting a bit of a background noise. If you guys could just mute while you're not talking. We're going to be taking turns with who goes first, so Will to Power will be going first. He's going to answer the question, what is free will? He'll have 5 minutes to do that, and then Zach will have a 2-minute rebuttal. Go ahead, Will.
I believe that Zach sort of touched on the same position that I have in accordance with the definition of free will. It is essentially when I usually think about free will, it is the strong position is that human beings are essentially dual-natured, and this dual nature is given to us by a higher power or a supernatural realm, and it is this like faculty of humanity that allows us to break causality within the physical world. Now you can say ultimately that all things are along the chain of causality, just not a physical cause. And I think that's essentially the position of Christianity traditionally, and I outright deny that position. Interested to hear this soft position that apparently the Greeks held, in accordance that the choice is part of the causal link. I think that it'll come down to, again, the freeness of the choice, whether or not free will exists. I think that yes, you can have less or more uncoerced actions, but they're all ultimately coerced. So I think just about definitionally, that's why I deny that free will exists. When it comes to agency, though, which is essentially my the position that I'm defending, it is to retort against Zach a little bit. It is something that can falsify and make predictions against free will. I think that agency makes more predictions, and agency has the possibility to not only be something that is that individuals have a responsibility for, but also organizations, institutions, and so on and so forth. So I think that agency actually makes more predictions, and if you use a evolutionary excuse me, I'm trying to think of the word. If you use an evolutionary paradigm, you can actually explain why human beings can hypothesize and abstract different realms of possibility. This would be when you walk in the in the jungle or in the forest and you hear noises, you automatically assume in the more animalistic parts of your brain, in the instinctual levels, that there is something out there that's following me, or there could be predators afoot, or a whole number of things, and this is why there is a faculty in the brain that hypothesizes these terrible events happening. And there's also the rational side of your brain, quote unquote, that'll say, no, it's a very low probability of that being the case, so just relax. And so I don't think that this is a spiritual thing within human beings that will hypothesize possible futures and decide from them. I think it's either the desire for one of these options to come about. For example, am I going to fast for a week when there's a literal feast in front of me? It depends on why you're fasting in the first place and how good the food is. If you're allergic to the food in front of you, then obviously you're not going to eat it. You can continue to fast. So I think that the desires and also the influences of biology are so intertwined with an individual's choice. To call them free, I think, is just not the case. How am I going for time, Jen?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. So It is for me purely definitional. I don't have much else to say other than maybe to retort one of Josh's points that he made in his introduction about phenomenology. It's the appearance of free will, therefore it is free will. I mean, obviously, the sky appears to be blue, so the sky is blue, except the sky changes color all the time. So is the sky actually blue? This comes into subjective absolutism. So obviously, I don't think we can go into our founding axioms beforehand. The audience is familiar with my terms of subjective absolutism. It is essentially that human beings behave in a finite world, so we cannot know objective truths. And I think that claiming free will from a supernatural sense, which I understand Zach isn't defending today, but that is essentially a claim about a world that we cannot know and have to take on faith. When it comes to agency or soft free will, as Zach described it, we can know a lot more about it. It just seems to me that because we cannot be predicted, therefore we have freedom. That comes into the uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics. We can predict for it. We cannot predict exactly where the electron's going to lie. That to me doesn't mean that we have freedom. It just means there's a little bit of randomness. There is a variable that we cannot account for. And that I don't see that freedom arises in that. It just is random. So I think I'll finish on that note.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Zach. What is free will?
All right, so just to rebut what Will to Power said in less than 2 minutes, first I want to talk about agency. Okay, so Will to Power did not define agency. I'd like to define agency according to how Aristotle defined agency. Aristotle defined agency, a thing is an agent when its motivating principle is internal. So if you throw a rock's motivating principle is external. It's you throwing that rock. So that rock is not an agent. Okay, but when an animal moves, when an animal hunts, its internal agency is its internal motivating principle is within it. So that animal is an agent. All right, free will fits within this concept of agency. It's just a higher level of agency whereas an animal is moved by its only by passions. Humans have an intellect, and with this intellect, they're able to discern different options for coming about a good result. Okay, now I want to talk about these animal instincts and these passions. Aristotle actually does allow for animal instincts and passions, and he talks about them, and he says that when we act from our animal instincts, when we act from our passions, we are not acting with free will. The only time we act with free will is when we are using our rationality to determine from multiple options for a good end. Okay, and also I wanted then to address this idea of the ultimate aesthetic. The ultimate aesthetic exists. Well, I tend to agree. I think good is multifaceted. I think aesthetics are multifaceted. I definitely think there's a such thing as bad aesthetics. But I think if we're going to compare, say, the Japanese aesthetics versus the old European aesthetics, I think that they're both really good sets of aesthetics and completely different. So, that's basically what I want to say to refute what Will to Power has said so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Yes, sorry, I got that one wrong. That was the 2-minute rebuttal. So, Zach, you can go ahead with your 5-minute definition of what is free will, and then we'll rebut that.
And my understanding is that it's going to be a 9-minute definition. Is that correct?
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's right. Go ahead.
Okay, I will begin now. So first thing I want to do is lay down a couple of axioms. An axiom is a premise that cannot be proven of itself and does not need to be proven because it's self-evident. Okay, and axioms form the basis of all rational argumentation. First axiom that I want to lay down is that possibilities exist. For instance, if a car is in front of you and it has its turn signal on, it is likely that it will turn, but it's also possible that it will not. And it's also possible that it will turn in the opposite direction of its signal. These possibilities do exist. Second axiom. There are things that are impossible. For instance, the car cannot turn both left and right at the same time. So if any of you are smart Alex and thinking that, well, the car could just split itself in two and then it could turn both ways at the same time, actually there would be two half cars, one turning left and one turning right. But that wouldn't be the whole car turning both left and right. For the whole car to turn both left and right at the same time is quite impossible. Second axiom, there are things that are impossible. So our first two axioms, possibilities exist, some things are impossible. Now what I'm going to do is define free will again. Free will is our ability to choose from among multiple possibilities of rational behavior, free from coercion by our passions or our animal instincts. Okay, and this is a weak version of free will, where free will doesn't include choosing to behave irrationally. And when we behave irrationally, we are being moved by our passions and not our intellect. Okay, so now I'm going to define free. Free, we're talking in the sense of libera, that's the Latin sense. There's also a German sense, which means something completely different, comes from frei, but the Latin sense means to be without restraint or coercion. The only part of the will that is free is its power to choose from among multiple rational possibilities, and there's so much more to the will than this, okay? The freedom of choice doesn't apply to the other areas of the will, because when the other areas of the will act, there is no choice. It can only do one thing. So in order to understand this better, now I'm going to define what the will is. Okay, so first I have to lay down a few more axioms as groundwork to define the will. First axiom: man is a rational animal, meaning that we are basically animals like all the other animals, with the difference that we have an intellect. Okay. Second axiom I'm going to lay down is that man has two major faculties, two major sets of powers. Okay, and these powers are cognition and appetite. Okay, so the two major faculties, let me talk about the faculty of cognition first. And that can be broken up into two faculties within cognition. The first is the faculty of sensation. This is our five senses. Okay, sight, touch, hearing, taste, and smell. And this is how we perceive the world. The second faculty of cognition, this is the higher faculty, it's the intellect. And this includes the powers of attention, conception, judgment, reasoning, reflection, and self-consciousness. Generally speaking, and for simplicity's sake, it's useful to think of these faculties as passive perception of the world and of ideas. Okay, and then the second major group of faculties are our faculties of appetite. These are our active faculties. Okay, appetite simply means a tendency to move toward another thing. It might be helpful to think of appetite as being like gravitation, but we're talking about people instead of astral bodies such as planets. And there are three main appetite faculties, but I'm only here to talk about two. And those are the passions and the will. Okay, so first I'll talk about the passions, which are also called the sensitive appetites because they follow the cognitive faculties of the senses. And it works like this. If you see something and you want it, you go after it. That's what the sensitive appetite does. That's what the passions do. Okay, and they manifest through emotions such as desire, love, hatred, joy, and sadness. And this is how Aristotle defined passions. This has been the definition of passion for 2,500 years. And from now on, I'm going to use the word passion instead of sensitive appetite. Second group of appetites are the intellectual appetites, which are also called the will. And it works like this. The intellect perceives that something is reasonably worth pursuing, so the person goes after that thing. Okay, that's how the will works. And generally, the passions are stronger than the will, but ideally, the will should regulate the passions. This is rare in a person. The will always pursues ultimate happiness as its final end. Okay, and if a person does something that will ultimately result in something other than ultimate happiness, such as murdering somebody or overeating, this is the result of being a slave to the passions. It is not an act of will. Rather, it is a failure of the will. The only thing the will has freedom in is in choosing from alternative means to obtain happiness. So to recap here, the passions are the sensitive appetite. They follow the cognitive faculties of the senses, which perceive. And animals have passions and humans have passions. That's what we share with the animals. Okay. And they're very strong and they move us in a very strong manner. Okay. Whereas the intellectual appetite, the will, follows the cognitive faculty of the intellect. So our intellect perceives something that's reasonable. So our will moves our body to follow this path of reason. That's what the will does. Okay, and the will isn't free in doing anything because freedom doesn't apply to pursuing the good. All you can do is pursue the good, except where it comes to means to ends. the ability to choose and act from multiple possibilities, all of which are ordered towards this good end, which is happiness. Now, I apologize for not using all my time, but that is all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Over to you, Will to Power, for a 2-minute rebuttal.
I'll define agency as the ability to be responsible for something, or being responsible. So, for example, you can have, I understand the Grecian definition for agency, having a motivating force that's internal, but nowadays, if you speak in legalistic terms, you can also have an agent for a football player, or an agent for or representative for a parliament, a senate, or a corporation. These are all agents acting on external forces. They're not internal at all. So I think that you can definitely have agency go both ways. What I'm hearing from Zach's position is essentially the same position that phenomenologists and generative anthropologists believe, which is essentially that human beings along the evolutionary timeline, at least in my conception of how this would come about, is that human beings have an intellect that has developed after these evolutionary causes and is now part of the causal chain of events. I would agree with that, but again, it is just the definition of what we consider to be free. Zach said that a choice is free when it's free from the passions, but then he said that part of these passions is the will, but then redefined the passions, and this isn't to criticize, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. Redefine the passions as purely the sensuous passions, and so the will has freedom of choice because it has different options open, but the will always choose something that is most aligned with itself. We're not being overridden by the passions, and when the will cannot override the passions, it is because it cannot, not because it will not. And so again, to me, I don't see where the freedom comes about. Yes, we have options. Yes, there's a little bit of randomness, but to try and pin down the freedom of our choices, or the uncoerced nature of them, seems to be very vague, and it's quite easy to not falsify something when it's that vague.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a rebuttal. Will to Power. We will go to the next question, number 2. What historical philosopher was most correct in their answer to the question of free will? That goes to you, Zach, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, so the philosopher that has the best answer to the question would be, in my opinion, Thomas of Aquinas. This fellow lived in the 1200s AD, and this guy is a really interesting person in that he's sort of like a European Siddhartha. Okay, he was born very wealthy into a very powerful, noble family. He gave up all of his possessions to become a monk and a philosopher. Okay, and this very much upset his family, but he went ahead and did it, and he became arguably the greatest philosopher in all of history. And his discussion of free will was preeminent throughout Europe for 500 years, okay, until René Descartes sloppily and unwisely rejected it. Descartes himself, in turn, was quickly rejected by his successors, such as Hume, and philosophy continued a downward spiral from this point to this day. Now, fortunately, the school of Thomism has quietly persisted and has never actually been refuted, and still contains answers that are relevant for today. Regarding free will, he synthesized the philosophies, Thomas Aquinas synthesized the philosophies of pagan and Christian philosophers who preceded him. Chief among these philosophers was the great Aristotle, who lived in the 300s BC. He's arguably the greatest of philosophers. It's either him or it's Plato, okay? And they have a lot of overlap. He described the faculties of man that I described in my first answer, and he also talked, now there's some scholarships that try and say that he didn't talk about free will, but he really did, because he talked about these faculties, and he also talked about our ability to, the power of self-control and making good choices, which he called enkratia. I'd like to use the remainder of my time to say a few of his quotes. He said The will is in reason. Well, in the irrational part of the soul are desire and anger. Okay, he said that the will is of the end, well, choice is of the means. Choice, that's our free will. Okay, and he said that choice regards not the end, but the means to the end. Okay, and he's saying this in his book on ethics, book 3. And he also says that the delight or the lust of pleasure destroys the judgment of prudence. In other words, the passions can overtake the free will. All right. And he also says that the reason which resides in the will moves by its command of the determined and desirous powers, not indeed by a despotic sovereignty, as a slave is moved by his master, but by a royal and politic sovereignty, as free men are ruled by a governor and can nevertheless act counter to his commands. Okay, and that's all about all I want to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Over to you, Will to Power, for a 2-minute rebuttal.
I like the fact that you're pro-Aristotle rather than pro-Plato. That's a meme that goes quite a ways back. Plato is fake and gay. But to rebut, I think this is really coming down to definitions, especially when defending, excuse me, soft free will. We don't choose our will. Our will seems to be something that is imbued in us, either in the spirit or in the personality, or the soul, or whatever you would like to call it. And we have a desire and essentially a passion for seeking after our will, our aesthetic. And so when we talk about freedom from the passions, yes, we can, in a sense, subside and appease our worldly passions for a time, or we can ignore them, or we can discipline ourselves to to have them under our control for the most part, yes. But that is only, excuse me again, that is only because we are trying to fulfill a separate desire, a separate passion for our aesthetic. One, the sensual would be very short term, and essentially a bottomless pit. But so also would the larger will be a ever ascending ladder. And so it's essentially which desire is ruling out at the certain time. Have you appeased your passions enough that the will can manifest, or have you not? And if you have not, then the passions will override the will, as Zachary has pointed out. And that's for good reason, because if you didn't eat, if you didn't reproduce, we would not be here to talk about if we have free will or not. So I think these passions definitely have a place to play within the human being, within human society. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Will to Power. What historical philosopher was most correct in their answer to the question of free will?
Well, I had a very short and sweet answer to that, and I probably won't use my whole time. But essentially, Democritus, which was the philosopher that came up with the idea of the atom, this indivisible part, and that it was a very materialistic philosopher, thinking that the soul didn't really exist; everything was material causes, which is essentially similar to what Jennifer and I believe. But it didn't. Obviously, they didn't have quantum physics at the time, and so essentially, the argumentation is essentially the same, that one particle hits another, hits another, hits another, and there is no choice in the matter, although we can hypothesize different routes that we could have taken, as in things that were not impossible for us to do. But to me, that does not mean that these possibilities were possibilities. For example, that we can hypothesize within the realm of physics that these things could have happened, but because of who we are and because of the necessities of the situation, we couldn't have actually made those choices. That's my position. That causality will always be what it always has been, and there is a predetermined or fated or destined choice that will be taken, or decision, or however you want to make it. Now, with regards to agency and how that manifests similarly but separately from free will, it is that it's the responsibility. So, for example, there will be people that say we have no free choice. We are all meatbag automatons that don't have anything to do with the universe, and it's all the universe's fault. So I can point to the universe and say, you need to fix your shit. Okay, let's see how that strategy works. I seem to think that if I'm walking and I stub my toe on a bit of furniture, I have two options: move my toe and make sure I don't step on it again, or move the furniture, because it was my toe contacting the furniture that created that situation. Both are an agent in the world, but am I going to yell at the couch and tell it to move, or am I going to take responsibility for my actions and move the couch? It is all about, as Aristotle pointed out, it's the means to the ultimate desire, and the ultimate desire is I don't like getting my toe stubbed. So this is where agency seems to play out. You can have agents within a community as well. For example, you can have someone who's rehabilitating off drugs or alcohol, and it's very easy to see that if they go back to, and this is proven in AA and how it works in a 12-step program, if you put the individual back in the same circumstances that made them alcoholic in the first place, chances are they'll become alcoholic again. So what you need to do is you need to separate them from those toxic people. Same when you quit smoking. You need to separate them from those toxic people and try and create new patterns of behavior. You're essentially rewiring the brain in order to manifest this agency and this new will that the person has. And obviously they desire not to be a drunkard for a certain reason, but they also desire to be a drunkard for a certain reason. And we are trying to create an environment that manifests the more positive will than the negative, or the sensual passions over the intellectual. And agency can also work in a multi-individual way, in a collective way, I should say, that people can work together to create more agency, more freedom. And so I don't see that freedom comes about from something that is imbued into a human being, whether that be its intellect or whether it be its spiritual nature. It is something that comes about when one is in a collective that has enough power to manifest these things, has enough collective might in order to change reality into the way they see fit. The choice maybe there is possibilities of choosing otherwise. I just deny that, because I don't see people, as they say, you cannot turn left and right at the same time. So you can say in hindsight, yes, that was destined to happen. Do we have all the variables to predict behavior? No, and you cannot even predict behavior on a quantum level. So how can you predict higher forms, which are obviously more complex? That is just not reality. But are you going to say that the photon was free in choosing its direction that it took? That's not the case. It's just a certain amount of uncertainty within the quantum realm, and obviously that would manifest in what we would call chaos or unpredictability in the higher order functions of humanity and microorganisms and so on and so forth. So essentially what I'm saying is that even though we cannot predict these things, even though they are uncertain, does not mean they're free. We just don't have all the variables, and possibly one day we could have all the variables. It's sort of my God of the gaps is just science, whereas other people's God of the gaps would be, Yahuwah, whatever they want to call it. So I think I've said enough on that point.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Zach, for a 2-minute rebuttal.
Okay, the first thing I want to make absolutely clear is I never meant to say that passions are a part of the will. If I did say that, that was a slip of the tongue. Absolutely what I mean to say is that passions exert an influence on the will, which ideally the will be able to overcome and master. And when the will masters this, it's called self-mastery. Okay, now I want to talk about this. It sounds like will to power is admitting that there are such things as options. There are such things as possibilities. But he's using a type of post hoc argumentation. He even said it. He's after the fact. It seems that, well, you only did one thing. And, it seems like he's saying that because I didn't do all of the possibilities at once, therefore the possibilities didn't really exist. And that doesn't seem to, that seems to be like a, non sequitur. That's not necessarily the case. Just because you can't do all the options at once, and in fact, that is a that's an existential possibility, impossibility to do everything at once, at least in this timeline. If there's multiple timelines, sure, you can do different things at once through the different timelines. But in this timeline, you can't do everything at once, but still we do perceive the choice. And then we perceive that we made the choice. Okay. And this perception is how we empirically determine what is real. That's how we determine everything that's real, is we perceive the world. And because we perceive a thing, we can reasonably assume that that thing that we perceive is real. This is the only way that we acquire knowledge. And if we deny that this is a valid way of acquiring knowledge, then we have basically limited ourselves and determined that now we can't know anything about anything because we can't even trust our perceptions. And that's just not a good way to live life. Okay. So, and then he talks about a photon, that a photon doesn't make a choice on which direction it goes. Well, that's true. A photon doesn't have agency. Okay, a photon is an inanimate object. It doesn't have a will. It doesn't have an intellect. Okay, so that's all I have to say, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. We'll be proceeding to question 3, starting with will to power. What are the main roadblocks in answering the question of free will? You have 5 minutes.
I think that the main roadblocks is essentially what Zach just finished his rebuttal with, is that we perceive it, therefore it is. But the problem with that is that if I do not perceive free will, then where do we go from there? So I didn't come about, obviously there are, because of causality, you can say that everything is within the realm of causality, because Jennifer and I do not posit a supernatural world, therefore all things must be explained through material causes. And so that seems to be, with that axiom, it seems to be necessarily the case that free will cannot exist, or it's this soft and vague free will that seems to be purely definitional. And so that's, I think, is the main roadblock, is that people say like, well, I think I do, so therefore I do. You can also think that you can fly, but that's not necessarily the case. And I think that to try and rely on human beings' perception, like obviously it is a necessity, but that we have to try and make the best of what we have. And we also have the abilities to reason. And so if you perceive something as, what's a good example? If you perceive something as desirable at the first hand, but then you sit and you ponder and you meditate, and then you find it not desirable in the first hand, which one of the two was it? Which one is right? We can never know. And that's a subjective absolutist claim, is that we can never know what is the ultimate good. And we're sort of acting on the best things that we have. And so the best things that I have claim that free will is not the case. If this is the crux of Zachary's argument, we're essentially arguing from the same position. I think not, he thinks so, and we're trying to create arguments to defend those positions that ultimately come back to that belief, is that we believe so. It's very hard to get past these debates, and that's why I'm not necessarily a big fan of debates per se, but since there was a challenge, I did accept it. I think that these things come through discussion and from discussing axioms, and so that's ultimately the roadblocks that prevent us from moving any further. If we are steadfastly in each other's camps and unwilling to move, then it's very unlikely that we're going to convince other people. To try and get over this roadblock, though, I would appeal to science. I would say that it isn't the case that you can break causality. Zach said that this choice is a link in causality, and it's free. And again, I would just say that it's not free. It's always being coerced by passions. It is just sometimes the passions are hotter than others. Sometimes they're calmer than others, and those things aren't really from choice. If your passions are telling you to do a certain thing and it overrides the will, then that's the case. And when that passion has been subsided, then the will takes place again. You can regret behavior, but you can take agency, responsibility for behavior. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the passions are wrong in what they do. Just because they're irrational doesn't mean they can't do good things. For example, it depends on the axiom. If you say that killing is always bad as a Kantian categorical, I think it's categorical imperative, that just killing is bad because you wouldn't want to be killed. Well, okay, but if you have a mass murderer that has killed 20 people and has said, I'm going to go kill another 20, is it not better to kill that person to prevent that other 20, or at least lock them up in a way that they cannot escape? You should be taking actions in order to prevent sort of things to happen. But I don't really know where I'm going with the argument, but essentially you're trying to do the best with what you've got, even though what you've got isn't perfect. And that's essentially where I see human agency rather than human freedom, because we don't really have freedom. We're always going to be influenced by our passions, whether that be intellectual or sensual. And I didn't say that the passions do control the will. I'm just saying that the will is another passion, intellectual versus sensual. So I'll give up my time there.
Thank you very much, Will to Power. Over to you, Zach, for a 2-minute rebuttal.
So Will to Power introduces the problem with perception. What if I perceive a thing and he doesn't? Okay, well, science, he appeals to science about this. Well, actually, science, first of all, the basis of science is this empiricism where we rely on our perception. And so the question of what if I perceive a thing and you don't is answered through the principle of replicability. Okay, if I can make an experiment and replicate that experiment, everybody can see the same thing. And if somebody doesn't see that thing, it's because the tools that they're using are faulty. Okay, so take a very simple example. If everybody gathers in my front yard and there's an apple tree in my front yard, and I say, hey, everybody, look at that apple tree. And then a man comes up and says, what are you talking about? I don't see that apple tree. Well, everybody else sees it and you don't. Maybe the problem is that you're blind. Okay. And I think that everybody perceives that there are these possibilities, and almost everybody, and they perceive after they've made their choice that choice was a free choice. So we're all seeing this thing and you're not. Okay. So maybe the issue is with your sense of perception. Okay. And that's my main rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Now we'll go to you for 5 minutes to answer the question. What are the main roadblocks in answering the question of free will?
So the biggest roadblock there is in answering the question of free will is that we human beings have a benighted cognitive faculty. And this means that our knowledge is woefully imperfect and our sense of reason is woefully limited. Okay, we do have knowledge, we do have sense, we do have reason, but it's limited. It's not perfect. So to answer the question of free will now, we have to use the sense of reason. We have to use the sense of cognition that's imperfect, and we have to use it to do a very difficult thing. We have to cognize in what free will consists, assuming it's real, in what it consists, its origins, and its ends. And then we have to test the product of this cognition against our axioms and our empirical experience, by which free will is disproven if it's found inconsistent. And if free will withstands these tests, then we also have to cognize other possible explanations for the phenomena that free will purports to explain, and then subject these other explanations to the same falsification tests. And this last part is especially difficult because the axioms that predicate the alternate explanations of these phenomena may be different than the axioms which predicated the demonstration of the existence of free will. Okay, it's getting very complicated now. Okay, and it's probably making your head spin. I know it makes mine spin. It took me a long time to think this out. A lot of effort. So when two alternate systems explaining the phenomena associated with free will, one that says free will exists and one that says free will doesn't exist, are predicated upon different and incompatible axioms, a resolution of these axioms must first be reached before any meaningful comparison between the alternate answers of the question of free will can be done. When more than one answer to the question remains unfalsified, then the value of the alternate answers must be weighed epistemically. In other words, we have to have a value system over which kinds of information do we value more. Do we value rational deduction or do we value empirical induction more? Okay, and then which kinds of information are we getting from these different systems of explaining phenomena. So this is all very difficult, and because mankind's sense of reason is so very imperfect, mankind only marginally and imperfectly has the talent to do this. Secondarily, the second block to this is that we have to overcome the false notions of free will that have been proliferated. And there seems to be a very mainstream belief that free will means our ability to decide between good and evil actions. But this is more or less recent idea that came to prominence. It did exist in the ancient times, but it wasn't the mainstream idea of what free will meant. Okay, and it really doesn't have a basis in anthropology or even our everyday experience. It's kind of a Protestant fideistic notion, so meaning based on faith. Now, our everyday experience is that we do things that we know are wrong and that we regret, but we are impelled nonetheless by our emotional desires to do these things. So free will in this sense does not exist. And it is not what was generally meant by free will by the medieval and classical philosophers. So another challenge is to set aright what is actually meant by free will. What are we talking about here? We're talking about free choice, the ability to choose the means by which we accomplish a good end. So if you believe that free will is something else and we try to debate whether free will exists, it will be a failure because we don't even have the same definitions, but that doesn't really seem to be a problem here. It sounds like me and Will to Power are pretty easily coming to an agreement as to what free will should mean, and we're debating on those terms. So we have overcome that secondary obstacle, but we have certainly not overcome the first obstacle, that we don't have a perfect sense of reason. I know I don't, and I hope Will to Power would also admit that too. I think everybody has to admit that. Anyways, I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you very much, Zach. So now we will be moving on to the last question, and that is answering the question. Oh, sorry. Will, I think you still get a 2-minute rebuttal in here. Sorry.
Yes, that's the correct. Thank you very much for that, Zach. Although what I hear when we talk about we perceiving something, you're appealing to the masses. And so you're essentially saying that democracy is the arbiter of truth. We all see the apple tree. You don't see it. That means something's wrong with you. Well, it could be the case, and it is very unlikely, though, that the apple tree doesn't exist in the first place. And then we run into the problem of a sort of sub-collectivization of perceptions of reality. I mean, it seems that birds of a feather flock together. If you're seeing an apple tree and he's not seeing it, and then he goes and gets his cousin, and his cousin doesn't see it either, now you've got two people. And so if we're going to talk about replicability, at what state do we, like, can both, is it sort of a Schrodinger's cat situation? Are both things happening at the same time? And then because of our limited faculties, as we do both admit, we have to try and remedy this situation, and it's possible that these things cannot be remedied. It may just be the case that we'll have one society that believes in free choice and one society that doesn't. And you cannot, this is the thing with axioms. If you take axiomatically that free was the case, and I apologize for the background noise, but we've just got people coming in the house. If you take for an axiom, essentially, I know this is not the essentially the a priori, but if you take within your society that free will exists, it's going to be very difficult to convert people that are adamantly opposed to that idea. The same reason that we cannot convert Muslims to Christianity, because they adamantly oppose it. It's just that it doesn't agree with their axioms. Their axioms is that Muhammad is the perfect man, and Allah was his. He was the messenger of Allah, and you can't convince them that people, unless they have some sort of miraculous event that happens that radically changes their mind. And those things seem to be outside of human control. It's sort of, it's in the realm of fate or divine intervention, if you want to call it. But to bring it back to something that's a bit more palatable and we can communicate on, I think that agency does make more predictions, or as much as free will. And it essentially, okay.
Thank you very much for your rebuttal, Will to Power. Apologies again for my mix-up earlier. Moving on to the last question. What ideology is most successful for parameterizing free will? Over to you, Zach.
So ideology can mean a lot of things, but I took it to mean the way we parameterize free will, just because of the way the question was structured. And so what I'd call the ideology that parameterizes free will, that basically sets out the parameters by which we can define free will, is this theory of the faculties of man, okay, that I set out in my first question. So I'll just go over those faculties again. You have two groups of faculties. You have your passive cognitive faculties, and then you have your active appetitive faculties. The appetitive faculties move us, and the cognitive faculties perceive things. The appetitive faculties go after move towards the things that are perceived with the cognitive faculties. So in the cognitive faculties, you have this faculty of sensation, the five senses, and then you have a corresponding appetitive faculty that chases after your sensations. You see that, you see that slice of pizza, and then and that's a cognitive sensation. And then your appetitive faculty says, that pizza looks good and I'm hungry, so I'm going to go get it. And your body moves towards it and you pick it up and you eat it. Okay. And that's what the passion does. That's a very emotional thing, very visceral. Okay. But then you also have this special thing called intellection. Okay, this intellective cognitive faculty, which is capable of paying attention to things, to conceiving of ideas, to making judgments, to reasoning, reflection, and self-consciousness. I mean, these are things that animals don't do, as far as we know, and as far as the data tells us, this is something that we do. And when it goes through this process, when the world we see around us goes through this process of reasoning, we might come to a different conclusion than we would have if we were just relying like animals on our passions. Okay. And so we have this intellective appetite, this appetite for the things of the intellect, and that's what's called our will. Okay. And so when we see how we are going to achieve happiness from a rational point of view, we see multiple means of achieving happiness. Okay. And that's where the free choice comes from. That's where the libera arbitrium, that's the Latin word for it, the free judgment. Okay. We're going to choose among these options. We're going to pick one, and that's what we're going to do. And if we are able to master our passions with our intellect, which is a very difficult task, if we are able to do that, then we will be able to freely make this decision without an influence of the passion. Okay. And so an example of that would be the hunter. He's hunting this deer. He sees this deer and he has a bow and arrow and he has a buckshot shotgun and he has a rifle and he could use one of the three, and he wants to feed his family. Okay. He knows if he used the buckshot, he'll be more accurate, but it'll be easier to kill the deer, but there will be less edible meat. He knows if he uses the bow and arrow, that will be harder to hit the deer. And either one of these seems like a good option, because if you use the bow and arrow, well, you get more meat. If you use the buckshot, you're more likely to hit the deer. Which one do you pick? This isn't a passionate choice. This is an intellectual choice. This is a reasonable choice, and you make this choice based on your reason. So, and whichever choice you take is your own choice. You take responsibility for it, and you take responsibility for the consequences of it. If you flip a coin, then you're not taking responsibility of it. You are abdicating your free choice to chance. Okay. But if you choose to do it yourself, then you are exercising your free choice. And you are, so this is the ideology. It's the theory of the faculties of man. And I don't think that Will to Power has exactly disagreed that this is what man consists of, is in these faculties. So perhaps we agree that if free will exists, that this is the best way to parameterize it. And of course, my position is that it does exist, and in fact, must exist based on these parameters. Okay, I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you very much, Zach. All right. So sorry, I'm a little bit, can you just remind me exactly where you are? I'm a little bit distracted. I'm very sorry.
Jesus, Jen. We just had, I believe, question.
It was question 4. Was Zachary rebutting or answering?
No, he was answering. So it was my rebuttal and then my answer.
You get a 2-minute rebuttal. I'm so sorry again. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've got here a couple of points that I want to make. So I think I'll bring some of those into my answer as well. With the pizza analogy, look, I am deathly allergic to cheese. So I still smell a pizza and it smells very, very good. And there is a passion for me to eat it, but there's also a passion for me to stay alive. And so, this is where I would say that to say there is freedom of choice, it's actually a whole lot more complex than that. And that it really is where the passions arise that ultimately decides what the choice will be. It is not something within the intellect that, like, sometimes the intellect is the motivating force and sometimes it is the passion. And neither of those are free. That you either believe that the intellect is rational and rationalism is good, and that's the axioms that you behave on, but that's not really self-evident. Sometimes irrational things can, unbeknownst, make good outcomes. And also, to go into animals and having choice, I think animals do have choice. I mean, for example, when you start disciplining an animal and house training it, so on and so forth, it seems that they want to break the rules at the beginning, right? They can be spiteful, they can tear up furniture and all sorts of things, and it is essentially a battle against the will. It's a battle of your will to not see this behavior and the dog's will to do it anyways because of its passions. But essentially, over time, it'll transition to about, let's say you go to work and every time you come home from work that something's been chewed up. And then you start disciplining your dog, and one day it's 50-50. Now, is it to say that there is a will for the dog to eat the item of furniture, and then there's the time for, so the chance that the dog will not eat this furniture, and then the dog is having a battling of the wills? I think that may be the case, because ultimately the dog is trying to decide: do I want to take the chance of being disciplined by my owner or not?
Thank you, Will to Power. And now it's time for your answer to the question of what ideology is most successful for parameterizing free will. 5 minutes.
Josh and I do agree on the sort of the ideology of the faculties of man, and I would also bring in the quantum realm of that uncertainty doesn't mean that we have freedom. And again, as I was trying to make the point beforehand, in the answering to the third question, I think that agency can make more predictions and will actually have more power in manifesting each people's wills. And also, it is a fact of Occam's razor that we shouldn't say that we have this extra faculty of free choice when it's not the case, if that we can deny such a faculty and still predict the behavior. That's my position, and I don't think that the jury's out on that position, but that is the position that I'm defending. And I also agree with Zach's position of the non-Protestant free will. I think that the Protestant free will is essentially the idol I'm trying to tear down, and I'm thankful that he's in agreement with me that this like apparent arbitrary ability to choose from good and evil is absolutely ridiculous, and it does really come from either something predestined from the creator that's planted a seed in you to act a certain way and essentially has mapped out the general direction in which your life's going to take, maybe not the exact direction, but obviously him and I will differ on that. But to answer in answering the fourth question, I think essentially it does come up to, the empirical data, which is that we do have these apparent faculties in the human being, but that, according to quantum mechanics, the uncertainty does not mean free will. It just means that we don't have all the variables in to predict behavior, and that sometimes uncertainty is a necessity that ties into all the astrophysics of our sort of worldview. And I don't really want or need to go into that, but sometimes uncertainty is necessary to keep the system going. It helps update the system, so to speak. So I don't see that as freedom, and it may be agency, but it's definitely not freedom. And I just deny that we have freedom in our choice. We do have choices, but the freedom in it is non-existent, I think. If you're saying that we have freedom, it's just saying that we made an intellectual choice rather than a sensual choice. Now, if that's your definition of freedom, I would disagree, but I would agree that you can make intellectual choices and you can make choices based on your sensual appetites. And I'll cede the rest of my time.
Thank you, Will to Power. Over to you, Zach, for rebuttal.
I just want to address, first of all, this idea of desiring a pizza but being allergic to cheese. Well, it seems like that me and Will to Power are having a disagreement about the definition of what will is. It seems that will to power is actually saying that when you have a passion for something, that this is a will towards something. And I mean, I could see that sort of being an intuitive understanding, but the definitions are not on its side. The definitions that have been laid out 2,500 years ago and that were used in the medieval era and that I'm bringing, that I'm invoking right now are contrary to that. There's a difference between the passions, which follow the sensitive appetite, and the will, okay, the voluntas, which follows the intellect, okay? So an animal that's fighting its passions, oh, do I want to be punished or do I want to eat this thing, is it's just its passions fighting each other. This isn't a willful thing. This isn't a thing that it's deliberating on with its intellect. This is a thing that it's deliberating on with its passions. It's not even deliberating. It's just kind of, you know, which passion is stronger, its desire to avoid punishment or its desire to eat food, you know, and that's which one wins. It doesn't use reason at all. It just so anyways, now I want to talk about this idea that okay, so I agree with will to power. If we could predict human behavior perfectly, then that would falsify free will. Absolutely. But it's obvious that human behavior is still yet unpredictable. Is it possible that we might be able to figure out a way? Well, sure, I have to admit that possibility too. But the fact that we haven't figured out a way doesn't mean that that way exists. All it means is that you haven't falsified free will. And if free will remains unfalsified and it makes good predictions, as I said it does, then it's the better system to believe in. Now, will to power does say that no free will makes predictions, but I haven't seen those predictions. What are those predictions? Okay, I've said what the predictions that free will makes. Free will makes the predictions that you're going to perceive possibilities, and then afterwards you are going to have perceived that you made your choice freely. Okay, and those predictions actually do play out in real life. And how do you reconcile those predictions with a worldview that free will doesn't exist? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to will to power for a 3-minute conclusion. Thank you so much.
Essentially, we're trying to, we both agree on our empirical data. We both agree on what is real. It is just the categorization of these facts in which we disagree. I think that this idea of passions versus reason is, I think, a false dichotomy. I think that the reason itself is also a passion, or the reason is something that arises from trying to arbitrate between different passions. And so when it comes to different wills or different desires, it is the battling of these desires and the rationality that goes along with it that results in a choice. These things are not free. In any sense of the matter. I addressed the predictions that agency makes. Agency says that the possibilities that human beings perceive are a result of evolution, because when we walk through a jungle or what have you, we are hypothesizing that there's danger afoot at every turn. And so we are trying to incorporate and prevent these dangerous courses of events from happening. And so it is our desire to survive and to reproduce and to provide for our families that leads to the rationalization of, well, we're going to make sure that we don't go anywhere by ourselves unarmed, or we're going to just wipe out the apex predators of the continent so we don't have to worry about it. So that's essentially my definition and my disagreement with Josh. Oh, sorry, not Josh, Zach. That this is why we're coming to a different conclusion, is that I believe that the reason is another passion, and Zach's position is that, well, the ancients had it a certain way, and so we should just listen to the ancients. The ancients ain't here, and if you're going to say that we just need to wind the clock back 2,000 years, I don't think that's going to really work. And that's essentially my position. My position is that I negate the fact that the agency cannot make the same, if not more, predictions as free will. I think that is evidently the case. It's just that is not a majority view at the moment, so there isn't as much writing or knowledge on the subject, and that is my endeavor in the future, is to make it more well known. And with that being said, I'll give the rest of my time, and thank you very much for Zach for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Will to Power. Over to you, Zach, for a 3-minute conclusion.
Okay, so first I want to talk about reason and passion, just to respond that reason and passion are very similar. They both move the person, but and we address the similarity by calling them appetites. Okay, but reason and passion are different in that passion arises from the senses, whereas reason arises from the intellect. So it's not just because the ancient said this that I believe this. It's because we are making meaningful distinctions here. We're making a distinction between the intellect and the senses, and we're making a distinction between the way that these different faculties move us. So that's why there's a difference between reason and passion. Okay. Now, to conclude, I want to say that you are all going to be asked to answer a Twitter poll, and you're going to be given two choices. Do you believe free will exists or don't you? Okay. And I want to say that this choice, if you're answering honestly, is not a free will choice. It's not a meaningful choice. If you believe in free will, you have to pick that you believe free will exists. If you don't believe in free will, then you have to pick that free will doesn't exist. Okay. But what would make it a reasonable choice is if you change the question to imagine that you are the content director for this channel. Okay, and imagine that you have to decide. The question is, which person should move on to the next round to make things more interesting? Okay, now you have a meaningful choice. Well, you don't have a meaningful choice if you believe strongly one way or the other. But if you are sort of torn between the two, and you can see good reasons for doing either one, like maybe you think Will to Power, well, he's very smart and he has this very cutting edge modern way of looking at things, so he'd be better for the content. Well, but Zach Miller, he is bringing up these classical ideas that are kind of underrepresented on this kind of channel, so that would be a good thing to move forward. I like the way Will to Power talks better, but I like the way that Zach Miller structures his arguments better. We're anything like this, okay? And if and if this was the case, then you would be making a rational decision. You would have a true choice. Who do I send up forward, Will to Power or Zachary Miller? And that would actually be a free choice that you would be able to make. And so, with that in mind, you can perceive these free choices, and afterwards you will perceive that you made your choice freely. That's the prediction. I don't think Will to Power has actually said any of the predictions that no free will makes. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I just didn't understand it, but it didn't sound like he explained the predictions. I have explained the predictions, and I also, Will to Power certainly did not falsify free will. He just says that he doesn't believe in it and he doesn't perceive it. So with that being said, free will exists, and please vote that free will exists in the poll. Thank you.
Amazing timing there, Zach. Great job. And congratulations to both of the participants for their amazing work today in defending their positions. Thank you so much to the audience who have been gracious enough to ask us some questions that we'll give a 3-minute time limit for, but just take whatever time you would like within that, gentlemen. We'll go to Will to Power to answer the first question that came in. And this is from Gandalf, why do supreme personal sky god religions, i.e. Jews, Christians, Muslims, all believe in free will but create the most imperialistic and authoritarian systems? Will to Power, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, geez, thanks, Gandalf. I don't know if that's a genuine question or a rhetorical one. I think essentially my position with, as Zach would put it, the Protestant-esque free will that came about, in modern times, is essentially a very good method of scapegoating responsibility from institutions that are responsible into individuals, because it's like, well, you should have just made the choice better. And it comes down to a fallibility of humanity rather than a collectivization of our resources to try and change behavior in the most effective way possible. That's why I'm against free will in general, and I think that agency is better socially, because I think it helps us collectively, and it helps us move as a unit. in a more powerful and meaningful way to try and achieve our goals. Whereas free will, I think, is atomizing and it's individualizing in a way that is counterproductive. And if I may take a little bit more time to just make one more rebuttal to Zach, and I don't want to sort of go ad infinitum here, but essentially my position is that the intellect is a sense, that these cognitions that the intellect does and the processes that happen are something that one becomes aware of and is sort of goes on in the mind. One becomes aware of it and then one acts on it as if it was another sensory perception. And with that being said, I'll give it over to Zach to answer the Sky God question.
Thank you so much, Will to Power. Over to you, Zach.
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. I just have to find it again. Let's see here. Sorry, this is a bit difficult going through the chat. Why do the supreme personal sky god religions, Jews, Christians, Muslims, all believe in free will, but create the most imperialistic and authoritarian systems?
Well, that premise is all wrong, okay? The communists, the capitalists, any one of these people in the 20th century, in the course of 100 years, murdered millions and millions of people, you know, and there's a very strong argument to be made that within 100 years, these people who are atheists, the communists are atheists, okay? They went around murdering religious people, okay? And so it's not a sky god culture, but they murdered all these millions and millions of people, and they murdered more people in this 100 years than the Christians, than Christianity were responsible for the deaths of in their wars over their entire 2,000-year period. I mean, you know, if it's not more, it's still ridiculously disproportionate. So the premise is all wrong. No, the atheist governments are much more responsible for death, and the Christian governments actually, this is evidence that Christianity mitigated this human tendency for blood loss, for bloodlust. Okay, so that's my answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Zach. We have a question which is addressed to you from Dio Strabo. Do animals also have free will, or is it reserved solely for humans?
Thank you for that question, and it gives me the opportunity to answer Will to Power's notion that the intellect is just another sense, which in a sense it is just another sense, but the difference is that this is a sense that humans possess and that animals don't. Animals have passions. People have passions and an intellect. People have passions and a will. Okay, so no, animals don't have a free will. They just have this battle of the passions. They're hungry. They fear punishment. They want to procreate, and that's what moves the animals. Whereas we have this ability to analyze what's going on, to do high mathematics, to perceive these high principles of reason, and that's something that you don't see animals doing. Okay, so yeah, no, the animals don't have free will. The animals are just purely moved by their passions and instincts.
If I can make a quick remark on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to hear your answer as well. You're done, Zach?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Will.
So I would say that you know, free will is an arbitrary distinction based on intellect, and obviously people have different intellectual capacities, so they obviously have a different marker of this free will. And this is where agency actually makes more predictions, that the agency is on a spectrum, and there is no arbitrary distinction between the free and the agent, or one that is responsible. And so we can attribute you know, agency all the way down to the laws of the universe, and all the way up until you know, what type of cereal you're going to eat today. So I think that's why I think agency is a more holistic and better explanation of behavior, rather than saying, okay, animals go all the way up until this wavy little line here that we call free will, and now it's all human behavior. Now, I understand that obviously the passions do like interact with human behavior as well, but all I'm trying to say is that this intellectual capacity is something that isn't well defined. The intellect is not something well defined. Who has and who doesn't have intellect? Do all human beings do? Do retarded people do? Do vegetables have it? You know, vegetables as in people that are in you know, terminal what's the word I'm looking for? Vegetative people, as in like people that are losing their cognition. So that's what I'm saying. It's not something that's all humans have. So it becomes an arbitrary distinction on who is intellectual and who isn't, who has the capacity, who doesn't. Do all people have free will? And that's why I say agency is more holistic.
Oh, you're all done there, Will?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I've asked the audience one more time here if they would like to ask any more questions. Gandalf has asked, why are passions and appetites different, Zach?
Okay, so passions are an appetite. The will is an appetite. Okay, so we have the we have the sensitive appetites, which are the passions, and we have the intellectual appetites, which is the will. So they're both appetites. All passions are appetites, but not all appetites are passions. Okay, that's my answer.
Thanks. Did you have any thoughts on that, Will?
I think yes, they are appetites, but I would throw appetites, passions, desires, and wills all with the same, more or less the same definition. So again, it's essentially why Zach is arguing different from me is that he's created or has chosen the position that has created this separate category for human behavior that I don't see existing. I see it as people becoming more able to achieve their will because they have better options, which means they can act more responsibly. If you only have two options, then you can only take responsibility for one of those two options. If you have 15 options, then I think you have more agency to reach that will. I don't think it's a free thing because that will is unchosen. It is something that you're moving towards, and if you can move towards it in a more efficient way, to find the means to achieve the end, then that is going to manifest itself. Obviously to the person's cognitive ability, but not everybody has the same cognitive ability. So obviously not all people are equally as free. And so that's why I say that people have more or less agency rather than more or less freedom.
Thank you very much, Will to Power. We've got some more great questions coming in the chat. Really appreciate that. Gandalf the White asks, Zach, how can we have free will if we have concupiscence? And I have to apologize the first time I've seen this word. concupiscence. Do I need to look that up?
I'll tell you what it means.
Okay. Go ahead, Zach.
All right, so concupiscence. And, this is actually when you're getting into the sensitive appetite, okay, or the passions. And I didn't go this deep into it, but this is a great opportunity to do it. There's actually, let's see, there's two types of these passionate appetites, okay? The concupiscible and the irascible. Okay, so the concupiscible, the concupiscence, is just we see something and we want it. That's the concupiscible appetite. And you see the piece of pizza, you're hungry and you go get it, or you see you see a object of pornography and you do your thing to that, and it's like you perceive an immediate good in it, but it's ultimately not something that's good for you if necessarily. I mean, the objects of the passions can be good. You're hungry and you need to eat. Well, then that's that's a good concupiscence. But you're fat and you need to fast a little bit, but you want to go eat. Well, that's bad concupiscence. Okay, but the concupiscence is part of the passions. Okay, it's not part of the will. The object of the will is to defeat our bad concupiscence and concupiscence. I'm sorry, that's the way it's actually pronounced. When I first learned the word, I just read it and didn't hear anyone pronounce it, so I always said concupiscence. God has omniscience, but I have concupiscence, right? Anyways,
concupiscence.
Concupiscence.
Oh boy, work on that for a while.
Yeah.
So, Will to Power, if you want to take a stab at this one, how can we have free will if we have concupiscence? Sorry.
Well, that's the thing is I don't believe in free will to begin with, and Gandalf is just Gandalf posting with his big fucking words. And anyways, move on to the next question.
Josh Randall has asked me, give at least one manifestation in the human experience that alludes to the possibility of free will? I'll let the gentleman on the panel answer that, and if I feel I have anything to add, I might jump in at the end. I'll put it over to you, Will to Power.
Obviously, people perceive that they have will, but I would say that they perceive such a thing is because they've been told that from day dot. And so, obviously, if you're told this, like it's the same way that we perceive colors. Each person perceives colors in a different way. Like you think of color blindness, but they all call it the same word, so we can communicate. And obviously, I may not see the same color as the sky that other people will see, but we all call it blue. So I think that's essentially what we're talking about. Is we all experience the same thing, as I've already stated with Zach. We all agree that whatever the empirical data is, the empirical data, but our categorization of that is what differs. And so, what I would say, I do not perceive myself, especially not the Protestant free will, but I must say I'm more partial to Zach's position, although I just don't like as Zach has rightly said, it's been tainted by this Protestant idea of free will. So I do want to try and distance myself. I encourage Zach to do so also. I understand that it is a traditional position and it has a great and rich history to it, but I do encourage him to try and incorporate that into a ideal that is more in sync with agency, while still using these definitions and these arguments. And I think that's going to be something helpful for the future.
Okay, great. Thank you. So over to Zach. Josh has asked to give at least one manifestation in the human experience that alludes to the possibility of free will. So I think what he's asking here, and forgive me if I've misinterpreted this, is basically what's the strongest evidence for free will?
The strongest evidence for free will is when we're sitting around and we're deciding what we want to do next. And, you know, if you're lucky enough to have an end in mind, not everybody can. So real briefly, I'm going to go on a tangent that's related to this. Will to Power mentions that we have different reasoning capacities, and I would say that you have free will to the extent that you have full use of your intellect. Okay, so obviously nobody's will is perfectly free unless they have a perfect intellect. Okay, a person who is mentally incompetent probably doesn't have a free will, and that's why, like in law, they're not held responsible for their crimes. Okay, and a person in a vegetative state even less so. Okay, but a person with a reasonable use of intellect has a reasonably free will. So what's the best evidence that we have? It's when we're deciding that when we're deliberating on what we want to do next, because we have an end in mind, because our intellect is able to perceive a good end. You know, not everybody can do this, but if you can do this, you know, that's a good thing, and your will is more free, and you're deciding, how do you want to achieve this good end? How do you want to achieve happiness? Okay, I want to achieve happiness. How do I want to go get married? Do I want to stay single and pursue a discipline? Do I want to do a little bit of a mix of both? All of these are reasonable options, okay? And certainly our passions are going to be pulling us in one way or another. But if we can conquer these passions and look at this from a purely reasonable perspective, then we can make a free will choice. Okay, I'm going to make a choice that I'm going to be voluntarily celibate and devote my life to my science. Okay, I'm going to make a choice that I am going to seek a wife and start a family. Okay, these are all viable paths to happiness. All right, but and it's your free choice which one you pick, if you, to the extent that you are not coerced by your passions, and to the extent that you have full use of your intellect.
Thank you very much, Zach. I will take a crack at this question because it was addressed to me real quick. So I would say there are three roads to free will. One relies on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and a delineation of microstates in a fanned out manner due to something called interference vis-a-vis a slit. This is too complex to go into right now, but that path appears to lead to an even less deterministic view of free will. The other one could be argued to be that the path of realization of the extent to which we are, in fact, just biological robots, understanding the limits of free will, and then concluding that there is no free will may be as close to free will as we can possibly get, and an indication of some degree of freedom from these basic illusions of existence. And the third argument, which would be positing evidence for free will, would be the unitary nature of the Enlightenment state, which all sages seek and describe in similar ways across various religious disciplines. That's not to say that I endorse any of these as a justification for free will, but I would think if you were going to construct some argument for it, those would be the strongest positions in favor of it. All right, so I'm just going through the chat and it's kind of jumping around a little bit, so I'm sorry if you guys can see the questions. I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss any here.
I'm actually answering some again. He's posting in the chat. So when it comes to those things and you see my responses, don't worry about asking my opinion.
I just want to make sure I haven't missed any, and there's a lot of comments that are not questions. So can we, if you're asking a question, make sure you tag Jen in it so she can see it. And if you're not asking a question, don't tag Jen. Okay, thanks. So Gandalf, the pornography question.
The PQ.
Did you want me? Did you already answer that one, or did you want me to read it?
I think. Hence, why shouldn't we subsidize porn? I'm going to leave that one.
We've got on porn. Masturbation feels really good. Nothing feels better than an orgasm. Can't I be free to feel that good all the time? Hence, why shouldn't we subsidize porn? So I think this might be a troll question.
It's like if the ultimate pursuit of happiness is to feel good all the time, that's more hedonism. I think happiness comes into something that is more about fulfillment and meaning rather than just sensual pleasure. And I think Zach would agree with that.
Absolutely. And you know, the thing is with porn is that there's so many negative effects, and there's so many studies on the negative effects of porn. You know, it reroutes your pleasure structures in your brain, and it will kill your productivity. And I mean, you know, there's a theory that porn is kind of a conspiracy to kill our productivity, to keep us from going out in the streets and revolting and making this world a better place, because you know, it will take away your energy. You won't be happy in the end, okay? It's just a short-sighted pleasure. It's not the long-term pleasure, okay? Yeah, no, porn should be banned. Porn should absolutely be illegalized.
Yeah, you should join the high tea, no fat game, because that's how you get real BBN hours.
It's how you manage to stay focused for 8 hours of streaming without it ever going off the rails.
That's to keep things PG. That's actually something that I've experienced in real life. Like, there's something about testosterone, or at least like not having a dopamine dump, that maintains focus. And it really, yeah, you should be putting your seed to good use, I should say.
We've got a question here from Plume Serpent for Zach. If God knows all that has happened and will happen, where does that leave room for free will? Thank you very much, Plume Serpent. It's got a great channel. I was on it yesterday, so check that out for sure. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you for asking that question. This is a very difficult question, okay? And I actually didn't anticipate having to answer this question today, but I do have an answer, and I hope I can keep it straight. All right, so we're going to assume God exists here, and I am a believer in God. I'm a Christian. I'm a Catholic, okay? But I was planning on not having to resort to God in this argument. But this is this question more is a different debate. It's if God exists, then what is the implication on free will? Okay, so we can believe in free will without positing whether or not God exists, just based on the empirical evidence that I've described. But assuming God exists, what does this mean for free will? It's a great question. Okay, so if God exists, and I believe he does, he created this world outside of time. Okay, and he created every single one of us outside of time. And he gave us this thing called free will. Okay, and so how is it that God can create everything, and God does know everything that's going to happen too? So how can all these things be true without it implying that he basically created us as automatons to do his bidding, that everything we do, it's because he programmed us to do it? Well, the way you reconcile that is because God gave us this free will, so he allowed us to choose what we are going to do. He knows what we're going to choose, but he didn't tell us what to do. He gave us the ability to choose. So he created us, gave us the ability to choose, and then was able to foresee what we do because. And I'm using these temporal terms like foresee as though it happened in the past, but it didn't happen in the past. It happened right now. Creation happened right now because creation happened outside of time. So creation happened in the past and right now and in the future, from the beginning of time to the end of time. Everything is this active creation because creation occurs outside of time. And I hope that answers the question, but it's very complicated. And but I think that I think that if you can get on top of what I'm trying to say, then you can see how the two things are reconcilable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zach, for that very detailed explanation. Will to power, I'll read the question again. If God knows all that has happened and will happen, where does that leave room for free will? You can address this question if you'd like, or we just skip it.
Yeah, we can just skip it because I don't posit a personal God, so that's not an issue for me.
Okay, sounds good. We have another question here from Gandalf. How do I know that if I have multiple options of thoughts with which to choose, how do I know that my final choice is free? So unfortunately, this might just be a Zach question, unless, Will, you'd like to field this one, but you...
No, I think Zach can take it. If there's any further comments after his answer, I will make them.
Go ahead, Zach.
Thank you. Okay, so you can be skeptical about anything. Okay, so I see a tree in front of me. How do I know that that tree's really there? How do I know that I'm not just in some kind of matrix? You know, we can go all the way turtles down with our skepticism on our axioms, okay? But the fact of the matter is that absolutely nothing that we perceive can be absolutely proven. There's no way to have certain knowledge of something. No, what you can do is have a reasonably certain knowledge of something. Okay, so I see that tree there. I'm reasonably certain I don't live in the matrix. I'm reasonably certain that that tree really does have an independent reality outside of my perception. That's the best we can do as people. We can't know anything with absolute certainty. We can just have a reasonable certainty.
Will, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, basically, it all goes back to essay. I think Zach would mostly agree with the axioms that subjective absolutism stands on. You know, the fact that we both admit that human beings' faculties are restricted, finite, limited in understanding reality, and so we can only do the best of what we've got. One side may choose free will, one side may not, and your skepticism is valid, but ultimately you have to pick a hill to die on, and so we've just come across and formulated our categories of perception in different ways, and that's completely understandable. But I still would encourage dialogue, and I would encourage other people to to make their own cases for how they see the world, because I think everybody's got a unique perception. There hasn't been another one of you in the past as you are right now, so it's very important that people of high intellectual capabilities, who are very articulate, who are very disciplined and wise to stand up, say what they think about the world. It's almost a responsibility to do so, because it's a very valuable resource.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for addressing that. We have a question for Josh Randall to me. In other words, free will is too complicated and I'm too dumb to possess it. So just to quickly add to what Will was saying here, these debates are largely probably not going to change people's minds. And if you want to have the answer with absolute certainty, you need to find it. So you're not going to really be able to see the truth of the matter until you're actually there at that point of maximum will. So yes, it does take a lot of discipline to conceive of these questions, conceive of how to answer them, get models and make predictions, and build up your knowledge bases from there. But all that to say that if we can't tell, it's not that it doesn't matter, it's just that the truth is something that's very complex for us to really realize. And I think this comes back to this definitional thing of using the word free. So I just wanted to quickly add that. I'm going to check for more questions here. My chat's sort of jumping around, so I don't want to miss anyone here. Oh my gosh.
Jen, do you mind if I say something on that?
Yeah. Great. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I just want to say that this possession of free will is it's it's an ideal. It's what happens when you have self-mastery, is when you get to exercise free will. And I do not claim to have self-mastery, okay? I am working on my intellect, being able to conquer my passions, but I'm not there, and I don't think hardly anybody is, you know? But when you get there, that's when you manifest free will. So am I too stupid to possess free will? I have to admit that I am, okay? But I get glimpses of it, okay, and I think we all get glimpses of it when in those rare times when we are not being manipulated by our passions, and we see before us an array of reasonable options. And I think everybody has a brief experience of it, but to actually get to a permanent state of that, it requires self-mastery, and it's very rare.
Okay, great. Did you want to say anything about that, Will to Power?
That's why I say that, you know, agency is what exists, and one being more intelligent or more wise or having more options because of their family's wealth, they have a greater degree of agency. They have more things to be responsible for, and also have a greater chance of manifesting their will. So that's why I differ definitionally from free will. I think agency is a lot more explanatory and is more consistent, and there doesn't need to be an arbitrary distinction between you know, the freedom of one individual and the freedom of another. It's just greater agency.
Awesome. So we've got a question from Gandalf about porn. We will answer that in the post show. It's just not precise enough to the topic at hand right now. So I'm just checking over see if there's any more. Zed's asking, why are women demanded to control themselves, yet men think their roles to undermine this? I don't know that this is actually a question to you guys. I'm going to assume that it's not. I just saw the question mark. All right.
I think Cultibearer had a question. I don't know if we addressed it.
How can I comprehend the free will concept without the existence of free will? Let's let Will to Power.
And furthermore, how can free will exist as a concept apart from the experiential world if it is not real per se? So I'll let Zach take that one. Actually, no, I think I should take it because I deny that free will exists. I think, again, it comes up to the human being's ability to cognize possible futures for the same reason that I spoke about earlier. It's an adaptive strategy to hypothesize possible threats and responses to those threats. And so what we're seeing now is that area of the brain hasn't shut down. It's always active. This is why you daydream. This is why you think rationally and logically, because you want to see different routes that your mind can take. Obviously, your mind's going to burn calories either way, and so you're just trying to find a way to burn those calories in whatever way you see fit. And so to posit free will without the existence of free will, I think it comes down to definition of terms. Like, obviously, Aristotle is not a dumb dude. He was he saw things, and it comes down to the definitions. And what he's saying by free choice is that it is a choice that is not impacted by the sensory passions, or the sensical passions, I should say. It's an appetite of the intellect, and that's more or less correct. And I would just, you know, have different definitions and say that, you know, it's all desires. It's either the desire to manifest something that takes intellectual power, or it's going to desire something that doesn't take intellectual power, you know, i.e. Masturbation, eating sugar, getting high. Like, those things don't take much intellectual doesn't take much intellectual power, but they're ultimately the same thing. So it's just a definitional term. As I said, Zach and I aren't denying reality. We're just talking about, you know, how do we define it? How do we categorize it? What are the methods that we use to, you know, go into things like morality, free will, and so on and so forth.
Great. If I could hop in on this one, because it's a very good question. So just to go with what Will has just said here, I've got kind of two parts to my answer. I'll reiterate, how can I comprehend free will concept without the existence of free will? And this is sort of one of those trickster questions. It makes you sort of reach a limit in thinking capacity to some way. So the way I would explain this just naively is that as humans, we function essentially as pattern recognizers. And the reason we recognize patterns and store that information is to be able to predict the future with some degree of accuracy. And I think this free will concept comes in because we have such good models for predicting the future or some part of the future. We can say, like, if I put a bunch of bricks here, eventually I'm going to get a house, like as a very simple example, like this sort of pre-planning goes to the heart of what it is to be human. So I think where free will comes in is this idea, because you can predict some things that will happen in the future, perhaps you can have total control over some future event. And that's sort of the gap between what's conceivable and what's actually possible. And this question, I think, is in a sense very similar to, do you remember Will to Power when I, maybe we can just quickly digress to Will's main philosophical point, which is something called subjective absolutism. Could you just give us like a quick rundown on what that is?
Well, essentially, it's the same point that Zach made. The human being's realm of knowledge is finite, and we're trying to make objective statements based on finite subjective knowledge. And I think that is the largest non sequitur you can have. Like, okay, I perceive this, therefore this exists. No, it's just you perceive such exists, and that's the case. So subjective absolutism is claiming that every absolute that we make, for example, gravity exists, photons behave as particles and waves. Those things are true in the human context, but outside the human context and outside, this millennia, who is to say? We cannot say as an absolute fact this is the case, but we can infer and predict based on probability what is going to be the case, and that's a subjective absolutism.
Yeah. So in short, that we as just basically kind of conveying this idea that we as humans don't really have access to objective truths. And now the question I asked Will was, is that statement itself an objective truth? And this again shows the axiomatic limitations of logical reasoning. When you define your axioms in such a way as to be tautologically self-referential, they appear to be contradictory, but they actually aren't. And this is a very complicated subject, but I just wanted to quickly give that parallel before we moved on, because these deeper philosophical questions are very important to the discussion. I don't know if you want to take a stab at this, Zach. It's how can I comprehend the will concept without the existence of free will? If you want to just skip over this, or if you have a few words to say on this one.
I'll just say that, I think it's a great question, and I don't think that the fact that I can conceive of a thing called free will necessarily means that I must have free will, but I do think that it is some evidence.
Okay, great. I'm just scanning through the chat here. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of, it's sort of jumping around a lot, so I have to keep scrolling. Gandalf asks, so if you don't have self-mastery, you don't have free will. You may not even have free will even if you have self-mastery. It's just that you can't really conceive of what will is until you embark on the path of self-mastery. I don't know if either of you wants to, I think we've kind of covered this subject quite a bit, but if either of you has anything to add, if you don't have self-mastery, you don't have free will. I kind of feel like that question was directed at me, but sorry for like hijacking it there.
Well, if you don't mind, Zach, I'll take it first. Essentially, you can have more or less agency according to what discipline you want to subject yourself to. And, you could have, it's the only reason I'm not using freedom is because it's a definitional term, and I don't think that the choices we make are free. Zach and I are essentially talking about the same thing: self-mastery, intellectual fervor, not being overridden by base and short-term lived passions. We're talking about the same thing. It's just that I don't consider it free, and I think calling them free is misleading, and that's why I use agency. It's something that you're ultimately responsible for, whatever action you take. But it's to say that it is free and is, in a sense, uncoerced. It's just not the case. And so we are talking about the same thing philosophically and ethically. We are talking about disciplining yourself, thinking logically, trying to formulate your arguments in a way that is justifiable more than just my feels, even though it already comes down to that. But yeah, we're talking about the same thing.
Great. Zach, did you have anything to contribute to if you don't have self-mastery, you don't have free will question from Gandalf?
Absolutely. Okay, so that's a binary formulation. Either you have self-mastery or you don't. Either you have free will or you don't. But I don't think that this is a binary thing. I think that this is a spectral thing. I think it's better expressed by saying you have free will to the degree you have self-mastery. So, you know, if you have perfect self-mastery, you have perfect free will. If you have limited self-mastery, you have limited free will. If you have no self-mastery, you have no free will. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much. All right, let's see if we have any more questions. We got no apologies in the chat. Hey, how's it going? Nice to see you. Thanks for joining. Vance asks how we will defeat the barbaric tribes with a 3D periodic table. Will I make 4D nukes? I think that's a bit of a troll question, so
I think if we made the model out of steel ball bearings rather than clay, we could just beat people over the head with it. That's how we're going to conquer the world. Just everybody armed with 3D PTs.
In your mind, bro. In your mind.
So if it's all right with you know, everybody on the stream, if we end the formalities of it and just have a hangout, does that sound good?
Great. We'll start it up on another stream because I want to keep this one as tidy as possible, because I'm going to ask people to contribute their scoring if they want to get some practice in scoring debates, and put your actual scores and we can collate them. I haven't had a chance to collate all the answers in the chat, but I will go through that later. So one last chance. If you believe in free will, that's a 1. If you are against free will, that's a 2. We'd love to hear your response, and we'll have a couple of final words starting with Zach, and then we'll head over to the post stream.
Well, all I want to say is thank you for this opportunity. I had a blast. You know, Will2Power, you're a very worthy opponent, very intelligent, and it was a pleasure to debate with you. And Miss Jen, thank you so much for letting me come on your channel. And to everybody listening, thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving this a lot of thought. I had a great time, and I look forward to interacting with you all in the future.
Over to you, Will2Power.
Couldn't say it better myself. I echo all those sentiments. Thank you very much, Zach, and I look forward to opening communication lines and keeping them flowing, man. It's a good discussion, and I think, you know, ultimately it's just a different definition of terms. But you and I are on the same ballpark, so want to hear more from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I think we set a new standard today in professionalism, and I really appreciate the amount of duty and care you've put into your arguments. I know for a fact you've given a lot of people a lot of stuff to think about, and I look forward to the next time we chat. We'll see everybody hopefully on the post show. Thank you so much for your contributions, and we'll go into your more specific questions in greater detail at that time. Bye-bye for now.